The wounded sky. The first lesson of the war was volume. It arrived as thunder that did not fade, a grinding metallic weather that lived inside the chest. When the shells lifted, men stood blinking in a light that seemed wrong, as if the sky had been dented. Then the shouting began. Somewhere just behind the lip of a field, a figure in a brassard with a red cross on it ran. He ran with a satchel instead of a rifle, with scissors and morphia ampoules instead of bullets. He passed men rising from the ground like ruined statues and did what the war never did. He knelt. "Hold on, mate," he said, and made the first small border of order in a world that had come apart. In August 1914, the manuals were tidier than the fields. The doctrine called it the chain of evacuation. Collect, dress, clear, treat, evacuate. A calm ladder written in black ink. Reality wrote in mud. The regimental aid posts were meant to hide just behind the line, in a ditch or cellar, anywhere the world could be persuaded to be still for 5 minutes. A medical officer with a single orderly would turn his coat sleeves back and become a weather system of hands. Scissors hissed through cloth. Field dressings blossomed like white flags on skin that would not surrender. Stretcher bearers arrived in pairs, faces set in the fixed, practical kindness of men who move pain for a living. The stretchers were canvas and wood. The ground was shell-torn and mean. They learned to lift with the legs, to look at the hands for rings before the fingers swelled, to slide a man onto canvas without jerking his torn places awake. They learned to ignore the bullets that argued about their right to stand upright. "One more," they said, and meant it, and said it again. The first flood turned every rule into improvisation. On roads chalked white by crushed stone, long files of the wounded moved toward dressing stations in barns, chapels, schoolrooms newly fluent in groans. The air smelled of iodine and horses, carbolic and damp wool. Medical officers wrote notes on labels pinned to tunics. Name, number, wound, tourniquet time. The labels were little testimonies that meant, "This life has been seen." They tied them with hands that shook only afterward. Some injuries were old-fashioned, saber cuts from punctuation marks in a retreat gone wrong, bullets that behaved like bullets. But the century had brought novelties. Shrapnel tore instead of pierced. High explosive tattooed the body with earth. Machine guns learned how to write in lines across human flesh. The doctors learned the new grammar fast. They learned the smell of gas gangrene before lanterns were lit. The feel of a femoral bleed found by 2 fingers and a prayer. The way shell shock could sit quietly in a corner and not be noticed until the room emptied. They triaged with their eyes first. Reds were now, yellows could wait, greens could walk, blacks were mercy. The categories were cruel because time had become cruel. A man with a sucking chest wound took the cot by the window. The boy with a broken arm stood too straight because pride was a splint. A medical student from London tied a tourniquet with a bootlace and wrote the hour on the skin in pencil. A village midwife pressed a pad to a groin and began a negotiation with blood. A priest came when asked and learned that last rites are faster in a storm. Ambulances stuttered up in lines that smelled of oil and fatigue. Some were horse-drawn, the wheels singing misery over ruts. Others were motorized, coughing and heroic, driven by women who learned gears as if they were hymns. They backed to the door, braced for the wait, and took the next 2 lives into their care. On the ride, one man counted fence posts to stay in the world. Another watched the sky and decided he would not be commanded by anything but clouds. The casualty clearing station stood just far enough behind the guns to make speech possible. Tents and timber huts, canvas slung over resin, lines of stretchers, tables made of doors, lamps filled and refilled because the sun had become unreliable. Surgeons washed their hands until the skin protested. Then began the day's argument with rot and metal. The new war demanded new answers. Dakin's solution ran into wounds like a clear river. Thomas Splint's straightened femurs that used to mean funerals. Triage, a French word, learned English quickly, then German, then every language the wounded spoke. There were successions of sounds, the soft snick of scissors through tunic, the splash of water that was not clean enough, but was what there was, the click of hemostats like small, precise applause, the surgeon's voice saying, "Good lad," to a man older than he was, the patient's voice saying nothing, because the world had narrowed to a hand on his shoulder that did not let go. They learned to mark tourniquet times in charcoal and to loosen and retie before the limb died. They learned that a clean wound is a moral victory and a logistical miracle. They learned to feed men before operating when possible, to warm them with bricks from the stove wrapped in rags, to cover faces when sawing bone, because dignity is anesthesia too. They learned to amputate without hating themselves by counting the saved and calling it arithmetic. Between the tents, orderlies moved with enamel mugs of tea that shook and spilt and still did their work. A Scots nurse with salt on her tongue called every man son, and no one felt diminished. A French sœur hummed under her breath and turned fear down with a melody. An American volunteer, new to mud and old to grief, wrote addresses for men whose hands could not. She addressed envelopes to streets that no longer had houses on them, and believed in the post anyway. At night, the evacuation trains waited like long, patient creatures with windows for eyes. Inside, straw on the floor, stoves glowing, medics moving in corridors like remembered kindness. The train would take them to base hospitals near the coast, to wards with white walls and clean linen that smelled almost like trust. On the platform, the casualty lists piled in envelopes. A clerk licked too many stamps and went silent for an hour. Then continued. The living require correspondence. Back at the line, the stretcher-bearers returned to fetch the last of the days forgotten. They moved by touch, by memory, by the map of shell holes their feet had learned. They spoke softly to men who had taught themselves not to cry. They lifted and swore and joked, because jokes are ropes you throw across a pit. The last thing a man heard before sleep was often a joke told badly by a tired saint. The medics learned to hoard morphia like treasure and spend it like rain. They learned to write letters for men who could not, to find the right lies and the right truths. They learned the names of bacteria as if they were enemy officers. They learned that clean water is a strategy and boiling a tactic. They learned that hands are instruments if you teach them to be faithful. And slowly, the ledger changed. Men who would have died in any earlier century did not. Men with open fractures lived because an engineer designed a splint in a moment of luminous stubbornness. Men with gas-blind eyes saw again after weeks in gauze dark. Men with lungs like drowned orchards breathed because someone believed oxygen could be bottled and courage decanted. None of it looked like glory. It looked like laundry done at midnight because there must be clean sheets for the morning, like boots left outside a ward so mud did not enter with despair, like a note tucked under a pillow that read, "Back in an hour. Don't run away." Signed with a smile a man could feel in his fingers. It looked like sleep taken on a chair, mouth open, one hand still stained where the glove ended. The war taught its healers to measure victory in temperatures lowered, pulses found, pain eased. They came to understand that saving a life was a quiet rebellion against the premise of the age. They practiced that rebellion 100 times a day and called it work. At dawn, a bell rang, or a whistle, or a voice, because days must begin even when nights are unfinished. The medics stood, yawned, laughed without reason, washed their hands again, and went to fetch the next life. Over the fields, the sky considered itself. Somewhere the guns began to clear their throats. The second lesson of the war was endurance. The third was mercy. The medics learned both by heart. Angels in uniform. They arrived before dawn, when the lamps still burned low and the wards breathed like sleeping animals. Hair pinned, sleeves rolled, boots laced tight, caps squared as if they were helmets, not of war, but of order. The nurses didn't enter rooms so much as steady them. A ward could be chaos at 4:59 and vertical by 5:10 because 20 pairs of hands had decided it would be so. Uniforms hid biographies. Some were Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service, trained, inspected, fluent in both anatomy and patience. Some were voluntary aid detachments, the VADS, young women who learned as they went and made up the deficit with a kind of ferocious gentleness. There were French sœurs who moved like quiet bells, Australian and New Zealand nurses whose voices carried sunshine into damp tents, Canadians who packed competence into every pocket, Serbians who stitched with hands that had already lost too much, Americans who arrived with fresh starch and left with edges softened by mud and mercy. Their battlefield sat on wheels and canvas, casualty clearing stations pitched just behind the fighting, where shells could still write their signatures on the guy ropes. Wind ran through the tent flaps. Dust and rain took turns owning the floor. The nurses fought weather with mop and will, the way infantry fought wire, 1 square foot at a time. They learned to angle basins where the roof leaked, to pin sterile dressings to lines like laundry, to tuck blankets with a precision that said, "You are safe," in a dialect the body trusted. Each morning began with rounds, the choreography tight as a drill. Thermometers clicked against enamel mugs, charts were tucked under arms, pen nibs tapped dry, lamps trimmed, pillows shaken so the breath had room to sit. "Good morning, love," a sister would say to a man who had lost a leg and 3 illusions. How are we today? We because no one healed alone here. Blood pressures became communal victories. Appetites a cause for applause. Bread dipped in broth tasted like progress. A sip of tea was a treaty signed. They were engineers of dignity. A shave given to a trembling chin, a comb drawn through hair that had forgotten the idea of neat, a clean sheet pulled tight to erase the night. They guarded privacy with screens and with their own bodies when bombs made doors indecisive. A bedpan could be an instrument of grace if handled correctly. A word could be anesthetic. They were scientists of small margins, pulse, respirations, temperature, numbers that either flirted with catastrophe or turned back toward ordinary. They learned to hear the shift from wet to dry in a chest, to see when the red of a wound was righteous or wrong, to smell infection before it was visible. They charted as if the paper itself could be convinced to care, and often it did. A line that bent upward meant a man had come back to himself and the world. They were teachers. VADS arrived with good shoes and ideals and left with wrists like steel and eyes that could assess a ward in a single sweep. "Elbow higher," a sister would murmur, guiding a syringe. "Never show the patient you're afraid. Never let the instruments see you hurry." They taught new surgeons to respect sterility, like a liturgy, and old surgeons to eat when told. They taught orderlies that kindness has posture. They taught patients to breathe again, to swallow, to sit, and sometimes, when it was time, to go. They learned new medicine at the speed of need. Dakin's solution dripped slowly through glass, turning rot into clean silence. Irrigation ran on schedules written in the margins of notebooks that smelled of carbolic. Thomas splints turned despairing fractures into salvageable futures. Nurses checked their straps like sailors checking rigging in a storm. Chloroform lids lifted, ether screens rose, oxygen tents rustled. A sister's hand on a shoulder was the metronome the room followed. They also learned the old medicine that never ages, cool cloths to fevered brows, fingertips that find a pulse when the clock says there isn't time. They modulated pain with morphia and with story, telling a man about the village green as if they had seen it themselves, painting the color of a front door so exactly he could step through it in his mind. They smuggled letters under pillows like contraband hope, addressed envelopes to names that felt like spells. The soundtrack of their days never quieted. Scalpel trays chimed. Enamel basins rang. Boots struck boards. Whistles called ambulances. Far guns rumbled like a storm that refused to pass. Over it all, voices. "Steady there." Deep breath. "Well done." The notes rarely rose above calm, even when a tent pole trembled with concussion, even when the sky wrote its anger close overhead. A patient once said he could tell who was on duty by the temperature of the air. Sisters' quiet was warmer than blankets. They were strict and tender, a combination that made the impossible merely difficult. Clean hands, clean words, clean jokes. "Language," a sister would say, straight-faced, while a man's pain retaught him every profanity he had ever learned. But later, she tucked a chocolate under his cup or let him keep the extra slice of bread because rules are railings, not walls. At night, the wards glowed low, a constellation of lamps held at angles the stars had never tried. Dark made secrets louder. The nurses learned to lean close to hear them. Confessions that asked to be stored, promises that wanted a witness, fears that needed a shape so they could be folded. They became archivists of the unsaid, carrying words through shifts and years. Some they never set down. They were witnesses. The first breath after surgery, the first laugh after a month without one, the last look before a curtain was drawn. They wrote letters that began, "He asked me to tell you," and ended when the pen could not go on. They learned to cry where no one could see, between the linen presses, behind the canvas, once by the latrines with the wind loud enough to take the sound. They were fighters. When gas came snaking low over the fields, they tied damp cloths over mouths, dragged beds inward, closed flaps, held hands, while lungs argued with chemistry. When air raids found the Red Cross on the roof, they threw their bodies over patients and counted heartbeats until the dust stopped falling. When influenza arrived with its blue lips and fast clock, they worked in double time until time ran out anyway. And then they set their jaws and went back in, because surrender was a word for other departments. They were logisticians in a world that worshipped shortages. Gauze re-rolled, dressings re-sterilized, bottles refilled, rubber washed and powdered, needles sharpened on stones, because deliveries came late or not at all. They measured chloroform with an eye a jeweler would envy. They stacked towels like fortifications. They invented trays out of biscuit tins and splints out of broom handles. They made sterility in places that barely made sense. They were economists of hope. Too much was cruel. Too little was a crime. You'll be back on your feet by spring, when spring was possible. We'll manage, when the truth had sharp corners. They rationed optimism like sugar, enough to sweeten, not enough to sicken. They were defenders of the living and guardians of the dead. They closed eyes with fingertips that remembered the first color those eyes had seen. They combed hair, straightened sheets, pinned labels with names so the world would not pretend to forget. A small sprig of something green on a nightstand meant the universal sentence in every language, "We cared for him to the last." They were comrades. They shared tea sipped standing, jokes told in syllables, a glance across a ward that meant, "I've got this one. Take the next." They relieved each other mid-step and mid-sentence. They slept sitting up in linen rooms, one hand still open, woke smiling without reason, and went again. They kept each other alive so they could keep everyone else alive. They were scandalous in their competence. Men who thought women were ornaments learned to salute. Generals signed orders. Nurses signed outcomes. A sister could look at a colonel and send him to wash his hands, and he would go, because the bed in front of her outranked the bars on his sleeve. Years later, many of them would say their lives were smaller afterwards. No tent to hold back the weather, no ward that answered to their name. But the truth walked the world inside every man they returned to it. He married, farmed, argued, taught, built, sang, forgot the color of the canvas roof, and remembered the exact tone of a voice that said, "Good morning, love. We're going to try sitting today." The angels of the trenches did not have wings. They had caps and aprons, calluses and clocks, ledgers and lullabies. They saved a century, one bed at a time, and asked only for hot water and decent shoes. The war taught them that mercy is not soft, it is a discipline. They practiced it until the guns gave up for the day, and then they straightened the beds for tomorrow. When dawn returned, it found them already walking the aisle, already counting pulses, already ready. Outside, the sky reloaded. Inside, a hand smoothed a sheet and made a promise the world kept more often than it deserved. You are not alone. The hands of mercy. They were the first to step into the open when everyone else went to ground. Stretcher-bearers moved like punctuation between sentences of gunfire, appearing in the comma, the brief catch of breath, the moment the barrage lifted its head to think. 4 men to a canvas bed, 2 if haste bit, sometimes 1 if the land would not allow more. They learned the bow of the back that saves the spine, the rhythm that keeps ribs from jarring, the handshake of canvas that does not slip when the world is mud. Their kit was a litany. Field dressings, iodine ampoules, triangular bandages, tourniquets rolled like sleeping snakes. A flask that was not for thirst. They memorized distances by pain, 50 yards to the sap, 100 to the fallen tree, 200 to the angle of trench, where a man could be lowered without waking every nerve he had left. Easy, they said, and the word did work. Nearly there, and sometimes it was true. Night did not make them invisible. It only changed the math. Shell bursts stitched brief photographs across the ground, white frames where bodies lay like punctuation marks left out of their sentence. The bearers, counted by flashes, aimed for shadows, moved forward in negatives. When flares went up, they became statues. Breath held, the stretcher a table set for an unwelcome feast. When the light died, they walked again. A man could live to see morning because 4 silhouettes decided not to duck. They passed the wounded down like fragile cargo into the regimental aid post. A scraped-out burrow with a lantern hung low, a shelf for instruments, a bench for miracles that would not wait. The medical officer there had the face of a clock that refused to stop. He cut boot leather as if untying a knot in time. He probed for a bleed and pressed a palm until the world decided to stay. He tagged, tied, wrote the hour on skin. Behind him, an orderly boiled water that would never be clean enough, but somehow often was. From the post, the wounded traveled, on backs, on shoulders, on wheels that squealed protest, toward the dressing station where order pretended to be possible. Here the stretcher-bearers handed their burdens to other hands and turned without ceremony to fetch the next. Sometimes they took a sandwich in 2 bites and a cup of tea in 1 swallow. Sometimes they forgot to swallow. The return journey always felt longer. Empty stretchers are heavier with foreknowledge. They learned the strange etiquette of rescuing the dying. We're going to move you now, even when the man could not hear. This will be cold before the iodine touched. Look at me, when a shell asked him to look at heaven. They found rings and put them in pockets with the care of jewelers. They remembered names, or invented them when there were none, because a man deserves to be called something while his heart decides. The surgeons stood at tables made of doors and fought the day with steel. Their sleeves were rolled, their aprons stiff, their eyes red from lamp light, and the arithmetic of choices. A good surgeon learns to separate urgency from noise. This one could hear the rhythm of a ward through canvas, the gasping, the steadying, the hush that means the morphia has done its work. He picked shrapnel from muscle the way a miner picks ore from rock, careful to leave truth and take poison. He read a wound like a map, a clean entry and ugly exit, high velocity, a peppering of bright dots, shrapnel, a bloom without a hole, shock. On a shelf nearby, bottles waited like obedient soldiers. Ether breath fogged a screen. Chloroform sang its hard lullaby. A nurse counted pulse and pupils. "Now," said the surgeon, and the room leaned with him. He clamped, tied, cut, irrigated. He swore softly at a fragment lodged where fingers could not go. He praised the body aloud when it obeyed. He wrote findings in a script that tilted toward exhaustion and signed outcomes with a steadier hand than his heart. He knew when to amputate not by despair, but by odds. Thomas splint, on, aligned, checked, tourniquet, loosened, retied, stump, clean, conical, packed with hope. He spoke to the sleeping man as if he were awake because speech keeps the surgeon human. "We'll have you mended, lad," even when mending meant learning a new shape of life. He sent men to the evacuation train with notes pinned like passports to their tunics. Each line a small country that promised a future. Orderlies made the war survivable between heroics. They carried basins, lifted hips, fetched hot bricks, rolled bandages with thumbs that remembered the first day they bled, and the first day they didn't. They learned to swear like poets, and to be quiet like saints. They changed dressings without flinching and bedding, without waking pain. They were the ward's circulation, hauling, fetching, making the tea that kept gravity from winning. They memorized the names of men who could not speak and taught the new lads where the spoons lived and how to smile when nothing was funny. Ambulance drivers learned every rut by smell, every bend by rumor. The women who gripped those wheels with gloved hands discovered gears that argued and tracks that lied. They reversed to a door with inches to spare, while shells wrote unhelpful suggestions in the air. "In," they said, and the stretcher slid home. "Hold," they said, and the man held even when he had nothing left to grip. On the road, they sang to themselves, not songs so much as notes held long enough to carry them over a bad patch. When the engine coughed, they talked it into courage. When a horse fell, they loosed the traces and wept afterward, not during. Chaplains walked a line that had no map. They were called when morphia could not soften the edges left, when a hand reached for a prayer as if it were a cup of water. They learned the speed of sacrament. They learned to translate faith across accents and silences. "I'm here," they said, which is the first liturgy. They took last words and carried them like fragile things wrapped in brown paper to letters that began, "He asked me to tell you." They blessed wounds and reconciled men to the unfinished. They also wrote jokes in margins because sometimes grace is laughter that refuses to be quiet. Volunteers hovered wherever need made a vacancy. A boy from the village turned pages of a book for a man with both arms bandaged and discovered literature as if it were a window. A woman with a bicycle ferried messages between tents because boots were slower than heartbeats. A farmer brought eggs without asking permission and discovered he was allowed. A school teacher read telegrams aloud so that hard news would arrive by voice, not paper, and stayed to drink unsteady tea afterward, because that, too, is care. The line of mercy stretched from crater to channel. At its front end stood the bearers who played tug-of-war with fate. At its middle, the surgeons and nurses who altered the rope's angle. At its far end, the drivers and train men who kept the pull constant. Every link believed the others real even when canvas hid them. That was the miracle. Faith turned into logistics. Some days the system broke. Too many wounded, too little of everything. Then improvisation took command. A table became an operating surface. A door became a sled. An empty bottle became a drip when a sister remembered how rain learns to fall one drop at a time. A bootlace replaced a ligature. A hymn replaced a promise. A look replaced permission. Men lived because someone dared to do what yesterday had not been allowed. Night rounds taught the hands of mercy a second craft, keeping watch. They learned to hear the difference between sleep and sinking. They learned the whisper that means thirst and the silence that means enough. They adjusted pillows, hopes, expectations. They found the coin of comfort in small acts, cooling a room, warming a foot, straightening a blanket so order could return to one small rectangle of earth. Sometimes that was all the victory the day could afford. Sometimes it was enough to let the next day begin. And when the worst happened, when a chest stopped or a breath unspooled, those hands closed eyes and reopened windows. They labeled, lifted, carried with the same dignity given the living. They spoke the name one last time into the room because rooms remember. They wrote the date so that forgetting would have to argue with ink. Morning, when it came, always looked the same. Gray light soft on canvas, a kettle ticking toward boil, boots finding their own laces by habit. The bearers stretched backs that had slept in knots. The surgeons flexed fingers that had dreamed of clamps. The drivers checked oil with the attention of priests. The chaplain warmed his voice on a psalm and his hands on a mug. The orderlies counted gauze. The nurses had already begun. Outside, the guns rehearsed themselves. Inside, the hands of mercy made another vow they would keep imperfectly and completely. To take the next life as if it were the first. To meet the next pain as if pain had never won. To carry the next body as if the earth were watching. They were not saints. They were professionals. They were not angels. They were stubbornly, magnificently human. And that, in the machinery of ruin, was the sharpest instrument of all. The war's quiet legacy. When the guns fell silent, the hospitals did not. For weeks after the armistice, the stretchers still came. Men who had survived the last barrage now fought infections, fevers, and ghosts. The wards filled with coughs, with bandages that needed changing, with the steady rhythm of recovery that always lagged behind history. Nurses walked the aisles as if the war had forgotten to tell them it was over. Surgeons leaned on tables and looked at their hands, at the instruments lined like soldiers waiting for orders that would never come. Outside, crowds cheered and flags bloomed in windows. Inside, someone changed a dressing. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone died because the truce had not reached his blood yet. The medics understood before anyone else that peace has its own casualties. When the last patient left, when the last ward was stripped and scrubbed, silence fell with a weight that felt wrong. The nurses took off their aprons and caps, folded them as precisely as they had folded bandages, and stood looking at them like relics. The stretcher-bearers rolled their empty canvas and found their hands had forgotten what to do when they weren't carrying someone. The doctors sat with ledgers of names and outcomes, victories written in small black letters, and knew that even arithmetic could not hold the whole story. Some stayed on, tending the maimed and the sick. Some went home and found that home no longer fit. A few tried to speak of what they had seen, but words fell short or broke. What could you say about nights where you measured time in heartbeats and morphia doses? About the smell of carbolic and mud? The sight of a man waking from anesthesia and finding he had been remade? The world wanted parades, not patience. So they were quiet, but their silence was fertile. Medicine itself had changed. The war had forced discovery to work overtime. In 4 years, surgery leapt half a century forward. The doctors who once guessed now knew. The war had taught them the importance of clean wounds, of blood transfusion, of sterility as a creed rather than a suggestion. They had learned that shock was not weakness, but physiology. That infection was a foe that could be reasoned with. That pain could be measured and managed rather than merely endured. The field hospitals became classrooms. The Thomas splint that saved limbs became standard. Dakin's solution, once a desperate experiment, became doctrine. X-rays, once curiosity, became indispensable. Plastic surgery, a phrase barely spoken before the war, was born in the tented hospitals of France, where a New Zealand surgeon named Harold Gillies began to remake faces with the patience of a sculptor. The wounded came in as ruins and left as pioneers of a new kind of healing. Every advance had been purchased with agony. Every technique written in blood before it was printed in books. The medics did not romanticize it. They only vowed that no generation should ever have to learn so much so fast again. The war had also changed the face of care itself. Women who had entered the wards as volunteers and auxiliaries had proven that discipline and compassion knew no gender. They had faced the same filth, the same exhaustion, the same shellfire as the men they nursed. And when it was over, they refused to go back to silence. The hospitals had been their proving ground, and the proof was irrefutable. They would become doctors, surgeons, leaders in public health. The world had called them angels because it could not yet call them equals. But equality was coming, step by step. in clean boots that had walked through mud. The stretcher-bearers returned to lives that felt unbalanced. They had learned to carry men without judgment, to navigate chaos by compassion. Civilian peace was smaller, but they brought the war's discipline into it. Patience, precision, calm under fire. Many became orderlies, paramedics, policemen, teachers, the quiet professions that keep the world upright. They did not speak of the trenches, but when accidents happened, they were the first to move, the first to know what to do. In the churches and chapels of Europe, the chaplains who had held the hands of the dying preached a different gospel now, one of mercy, endurance, and humility. They spoke less about victory and more about service. Their faith had survived the mud and gas not because it was unshaken, but because it had learned to kneel in uncertainty and still offer comfort. And the nurses, those who had been called sisters even when they had no vows but duty, carried the war inside them as both scar and scripture. They became matrons, midwives, reformers. They redesigned wards, restructured hospitals, rewrote nursing education to match the realities they had lived. They had seen what human bodies could endure, and they demanded that peacetime medicine be no less courageous than wartime healing. Some never took off the uniform because it was the only skin that still felt honest. Others packed it away in trunks, thinking they were done with it, only to open it years later and find the smell of antiseptic and hope still clinging to the cloth. The world remembered them in postcards and poems. Painters drew them as saints with halos of lamplight. Writers called them angels. But those who had known them knew better. They were not angels. They were craftsmen of compassion, engineers of survival, scientists of mercy. Their miracles were measurable, their prayers practical, their divinity entirely human. When the influenza came in 1918, sweeping through the very armies that had just disarmed, it was the medics who recognized it first. They had seen lungs drown before. They had seen fever climb too fast. They organized wards again, rationed supplies again, sent letters of condolence again. The world gasped. They steadied its breath. Even in peace, they worked as if the front had simply changed address. And when decades later another generation went to war, it found that the foundations were already laid. The triage systems, the antiseptics, the blood banks, the training, the belief that no life was expendable until every hand had tried to save it. Their legacy was not only in medicine. It was in the moral architecture of the century that followed. They had shown that compassion can be as disciplined as violence, that care can be organized, that courage can kneel without surrendering. They had proven that healing is a kind of defiance, the refusal to let destruction have the final word. Sometimes, in the years after, a nurse would wake at night and listen for a sound that was no longer there. The rattle of wheels, the cry of stretcher straps, the soft voice calling for morphia. She would rise, check her clock, and remind herself, the war is over. Then she would make tea and sit in the quiet, grateful for it, guilty for it, certain it would never be total. Because part of her would always live where the sky was low and the tents flapped like wings, where every sunrise was an order and every heartbeat a hymn. The world would call them angels, and perhaps that was close enough. But those who knew them would remember them differently, as women and men who picked up the pieces of civilization and washed them clean, who learned that mercy, like war, can be industrial if you make it so. They had stood between life and death and refused to step aside. And when the guns went quiet, the hands that had lifted, stitched, steadied, and comforted, kept working, because they had discovered the oldest secret in history. The human heart can be trained to heal as fiercely as it once learned to harm.